My entire family called me a fool. They practically shoved the contract in my face, begging me to sell my late uncle's worthless, rocky 40 acres to a smiling developer. I was 10 seconds away from signing it all away, until I took a heavy iron crowbar to his rusted machine shed. Uncle Harrison was the ghost of our family. While my cousins and aunts gathered for lavish Thanksgiving dinners in the suburbs of Chicago, Harrison was out in the rural, forgotten outskirts of Oak Haven, living in a dilapidated trailer on 40 acres of the most barren, limestone-choked dirt in the Midwest. He was a paranoid, reclusive mechanic who hadn't spoken to my mother in 2 decades. So, when the call came that he had passed away from a sudden heart attack at the age of 71, the family didn't mourn. They calculated. The funeral was a pathetic affair. Just me, my wife Sarah, the estate lawyer, and my cousin Beatrice. Beatrice only showed up because she had a keen scent for inherited money, always convinced that everyone in the family owed her something. She stood by the graveside in a black designer coat that cost more than my car, tapping her heel impatiently. "I don't know why you even bothered driving out here, Arthur," Beatrice whispered to me as the casket was lowered. "The old man was a lunatic. He lived in squalor. If he left you anything, it's probably a mountain of unpaid property taxes." I didn't answer her. I was too exhausted. At 34, I felt like a man drowning in slow motion. Sarah had been in a severe car accident 8 months prior, and while she was recovering, the physical therapy bills had completely drained our savings. My job at a regional logistics company barely covered our rent. I attended the funeral out of a sense of basic human decency, not because I expected a windfall. But an hour later, sitting in the stuffy, wood-paneled office of Thomas Abernathy, Harrison's estate lawyer, my life took its first sharp turn. Abernathy adjusted his glasses, looking over a will that looked like it had been typed on a typewriter from the 1970s. "Harrison's estate is remarkably simple," the lawyer rasped. "To his niece Beatrice, he leaves the sum of $1, noting, and I quote, so she can buy herself a clue." Beatrice's face flushed a violent shade of crimson. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the office without a word, slamming the heavy oak door behind her. Abernathy sighed and turned to me. "And to you, Arthur, he leaves the entirety of the Oak Haven property, all 40 acres, the trailer, and the land's contents, free and clear. The property taxes are surprisingly paid up through the end of the decade." I stared at him, stunned. 40 acres? What am I supposed to do with 40 acres of dead clay and rocks? "Sell it, I imagine," Abernathy said, sliding a thick manila folder across the desk. "In fact, you already have an interested party." That was the first red flag. Harrison hadn't been in the ground for 3 hours, and someone was already circling his property. The next morning, the phone rang. It was a man named Richard Gallagher, introducing himself as an independent real estate developer. His voice was smooth, polished, and coated in a practiced, synthetic warmth. He asked to meet me at a local diner near my apartment. When I arrived, Gallagher was already in a booth, wearing a sharp navy suit that looked entirely out of place in the Greasy Spoon diner. He ordered us coffees and immediately slid a contract across the Formica table. "Arthur, my condolences about your uncle. I know this is a difficult time," Gallagher said, offering a sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll cut right to the chase. Your uncle's land is a useless stretch of limestone. You can't farm it. You can't build a subdivision on it without millions in leveling costs. But my firm is looking to build a commercial solar farm, and we need raw, unshaded acreage. I am prepared to offer you $40,000. Cash. Today." I stared at the number on the paper. $40,000. It was exactly enough to pay off Sarah's medical debt, wipe out my credit cards, and give us a fresh start. My heart hammered against my ribs. It felt like a miracle. I need to think about it," I stammered, trying not to look desperate. Gallagher's smile tightened slightly. "Arthur, I wouldn't think too long. Offers like this on dead land don't last. If my board decides to look at the neighboring county, this offer evaporates. Sign it now, and the money is wired to your account by Friday." I took the contract home. Sarah looked at the numbers and cried tears of relief. It was a lifeline, thrown to us in the middle of a hurricane. But that night, my phone rang again. It was Beatrice. "I heard you got an offer from Gallagher Development," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. 40 grand. You know Harrison borrowed money from my mother back in the 80s. You owe me at least half of that, Arthur. If you don't cut me in, I'll tie the estate up in probate court for years. I'll bleed you dry in legal fees before you ever see a dime of that developer's money." The pressure was instantaneous and suffocating. Gallagher was calling me every 12 hours. pushing for the signature. Beatrice was leaving unhinged voicemails, threatening lawsuits. I was caught in a vice grip, the temptation to just sign the paper and escape the madness nearly overwhelming. I sat at my kitchen table on Thursday night, a pen hovering over the signature line of Gallagher's contract. All I had to do was press the ink to the paper. But a nagging, persistent itch in the back of my mind stopped me. Why was Gallagher so desperate? Why was a high-rolling developer wearing a $3,000 suit, sweating over 40 acres of useless Oak Haven dirt? And why had Uncle Harrison, a man who didn't trust the government, the banks, or his own family, paid the property taxes 10 years in advance? I put the pen down. Before I signed away my inheritance, I needed to see exactly what I was selling. Friday morning, the day I was supposed to hand over the signed contract to Gallagher, the sky over Ohio was a bruised, heavy gray threatening rain. I threw on my heavy work boots and an old canvas jacket, told Sarah I'd be back by noon, and drove the hour and a half out to Oak Haven. Uncle Harrison's property was even worse than I remembered from my childhood. The rusted iron gate at the entrance was hanging off its hinges. The dirt road leading up to the property was deeply rutted and overgrown with aggressive, thorny weeds. I parked my sedan near the center of the lot. Harrison's trailer was a depressing sight, faded, dented, and smelling faintly of mildew and stale tobacco. I spent an hour walking through it. It was filled with nothing but old newspapers, empty tin cans, and broken toaster ovens. There was nothing of value. It seemed Beatrice was right. The old man had died in squalor. I walked outside and surveyed the land. It was exactly as Gallagher had described. Rocky, uneven, and utterly useless. Dead, skeletal trees dotted the perimeter. I pulled out my cell phone. I had no signal out here. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the folded contract. Just sign it, my brain screamed. Go back to town, sign it, and end the nightmare. I started walking the property line, figuring I'd at least get a sense of the boundaries before I left. The wind howled across the empty acreage, biting through my jacket. I trudged through ankle-deep mud and thick briar patches, heading toward the far northern edge of the property, where a dense thicket of aggressive, unkempt weeping willows and thorny bushes formed a natural wall. As I pushed my way through the thicket, ignoring the thorns tearing at my jeans, my boot hit something solid, not rock, metal. I parted the branches. Hidden completely from the main road, obscured by decades of untamed overgrowth, sat a massive, corrugated steel machine shed. It was easily 60 feet long, painted an ugly, military olive drab that had long since surrendered to rust and time. There were no windows. The roof was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves and moss, making it look almost like a natural part of the landscape. I walked up to the heavy steel double doors. Wrapped around the handles was a logging chain thick enough to anchor a battleship, secured by an absolutely massive, rusted padlock. I grabbed the padlock. It was heavy, industrial grade, and completely seized by rust. Suddenly, the crunching of gravel broke the silence. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Emerging from the thicket, pushing his way through the thorns in his expensive slacks and polished dress shoes, was Richard Gallagher. He looked out of breath, his hair windblown, and his eyes wild. "Arthur!" he called out, his voice a mix of forced cheer and genuine panic. "I went by your apartment! Your wife said you came out here!" I brought the notary. "We can finalize this right now, right on the hood of my car." I stared at him. "You drove all the way out to the middle of nowhere, ruining a nice pair of shoes, just to get a signature a few hours early?" Gallagher chuckled, though the sound was brittle and nervous. "Time is money, Arthur. The board is getting antsy. Let's get out of this mud, head back to my SUV, and get you your 40 grand. He took a step toward me, but his eyes didn't stay on my face. They darted past my shoulder. He was staring directly at the rusted machine shed. I saw the muscles in his jaw clench. The hunger in his eyes wasn't for the 40 acres of dirt. It was for the shed. "How did you know I was near the back of the property, Richard?" I asked, my voice dropping low. "It's 40 acres. You came straight to this corner." Gallagher's smile finally vanished. The slick developer persona dropped, revealing something cold and deeply desperate underneath. "Look, Pendleton, don't overthink this. You're a guy who needs money. I have the money. Whatever junk your crazy uncle left in that shed, it's not worth the tetanus you'll get trying to open it. I'll bump the offer. 50,000, cash, right now. But you sign the paper this second, and you walk away." The pieces slammed into place. Gallagher wasn't a solar farm developer. He was a shark who had somehow found out what Uncle Harrison was hiding. "Get off my land," I said quietly. "Excuse me?" Gallagher sneered. You heard me. You're trespassing. Get off my uncle's property before I call the sheriff. You don't even have cell service out here, you idiot, Gallagher spat, taking a threatening step forward. You are making the biggest mistake of your pathetic life. You don't know what you're dealing with. I said leave, I barked, grabbing a heavy, rusted piece of rebar from the dirt and stepping toward him. Gallagher stopped. He looked at the rebar, then back at the shed, his eyes burning with frustration. You're going to regret this, Arthur. I promise you. He turned on his heel and stormed back through the brush, cursing loudly as the thorns tore at his suit. I waited until I heard the distant roar of his SUV's engine speeding away down the dirt road. The silence of the property returned, heavy and thick. I turned back to the massive rusted shed. My hands were shaking. I dropped the rebar and pulled the contract from my pocket. Without a second thought, I ripped the paper down the middle, then ripped it again, letting the pieces scatter into the wind. I walked back to my car, opened the trunk, and pulled out a 3-foot pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters I kept for emergencies. I marched back through the mud and the thorns, adrenaline surging through my veins. I positioned the jaws of the bolt cutters over the thickest part of the rusted padlock. I gripped the handles, braced my boots against the steel door, and threw my entire body weight into it. The metal groaned. My muscles burned, screaming in protest. For an agonizing second, I thought the cutters would snap. But then, with a sharp, violent crack that echoed across the empty fields, the shackle broke. I unwound the heavy logging chain, let it crash to the dirt, and grabbed the iron handles. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the heavy doors open. The hinges shrieked in protest, scraping against the dirt, letting the pale gray light of the stormy morning bleed into the pitch-black interior of the shed. The smell hit me first: dust, aged leather, and high-octane gasoline. I reached blindly inside the doorway, my hand brushing against a heavy breaker box. I threw the main switch. Overhead, a row of ancient fluorescent shop lights flickered, hummed violently, and then burst to life in a cascade of brilliant, blinding white light. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. My knees went weak, and I had to lean against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. Gallagher hadn't been trying to buy 40 acres of useless dirt. He had been trying to rob me blind. Because sitting inside the climate-controlled, concrete-lined bunker of my paranoid uncle's shed wasn't junk. It was a treasure trove that belonged in a museum. Under the harsh, flickering glare of the ancient fluorescent tubes, the true scale of Uncle Harrison's secret was laid bare. The air inside the bunker was bone dry, preserved by an elaborate industrial-grade dehumidifier humming quietly in the corner. Spaced perfectly across the polished concrete floor, resting on heavy-duty jackstands to preserve their tires, were 4 distinct, massive shapes covered in thick, custom-fitted canvas tarps. My hands were still trembling from the adrenaline of breaking the lock, but curiosity clawed its way to the surface. I walked over to the closest shape, a low, wide silhouette, and grabbed the corner of the heavy canvas. With one sharp pull, a cloud of pristine, decades-old dust plumed into the air. My breath completely left my body. Sitting before me wasn't a tractor or a rusted piece of farm equipment. It was a flawless, midnight blue 1967 Shelby Cobra, 427. Even under a fine layer of dust, the chrome side pipes gleamed like mirrors. It was a machine of pure, visceral power, frozen in time. Frantic now, I ran to the second tarp and threw it back. A 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, painted in iconic silver, its red leather interior completely untouched by the sun. The third tarp revealed a pristine 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, complete with the massive rear wing, painted in a striking factory, Go Mango Orange. But it was the fourth tarp that made the blood roar in my ears. I didn't know much about the elite world of classic automobiles, but I knew enough to recognize the rolling sculpture beneath the canvas. It was a 1961 Ferrari 250 GT SWB California Spider. Painted in a deep, flawless Rosso Corsa red, it was a ghost, a mythological creature of the automotive world. These cars didn't just exist in barns, they were the crown jewels of billionaires. How had my paranoid, reclusive uncle, a man who lived in a mildewed trailer, amassed a collection that belonged on the lawn at the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance? At the far end of the shed sat a massive wooden workbench. I walked over, my legs feeling like lead. On top of the bench was a heavy, fireproof Mosler safe. The combination dial was taped open with a piece of brittle masking tape. Inside sat a stack of pristine, acid-free manila folders, and a sealed envelope with my name scrawled on it in Harrison's shaky, unmistakable handwriting. I tore the envelope open. Arthur, if you are reading this, it means you didn't take the easy way out. You didn't sell my land to the first vulture in a cheap suit who offered you pennies. Good boy. Everyone in this family thought I was a broke mechanic. Let them think it. Back in the 70s, I was the head restoration specialist for a private importer named David L. Siderick in Beverly Hills. I was paid mostly in cash, and sometimes I bought the undesirable cars the wealthy heirs didn't want to bother fixing. I bought the Ferrari in 1982 for $15,000 because the engine was entirely seized. I spent 10 years rebuilding it piece by piece. The world went crazy, Arthur. These machines became worth millions. If I told your aunt or your cousin Beatrice, they would have tried to bleed me dry. I moved back to Ohio, built this bunker, and faded away to keep them safe. The titles are in the folders. They are fully authenticated, legally clean, and transferred into a blind trust, of which you are now the sole benefactor, is greater than. Sell them. Pay off Sarah's hospital bills. Live a good life. And tell Beatrice she can choke on her $1. Uncle Harrison, I looked at the paperwork. Clean titles. Original build sheets. Authentication certificates signed by Enzo Ferrari's historic registry and Carroll Shelby himself. This wasn't a $50,000 payday. I was standing in a room, holding over $20 million in vehicular history. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I had walked close enough to the shed's steel door to catch a single bar of cellular service. It was a text from Sarah. Arthur, Beatrice just called me. She sounded insane. She said she's filing an emergency injunction to freeze the estate and is bringing the sheriff to the property. What is going on? The reality of the situation crashed down on me like an anvil. Gallagher hadn't just stumbled upon this. He had likely been paying someone at the county clerk's office or digging into old insurance records. When he found out what was sitting on this property, he reached out to Beatrice. They had teamed up. I had an hour, maybe less, before a corrupt developer and my rabid cousin showed up, with local law enforcement to lock me out of my own inheritance. I dialed the one person I knew I could trust implicitly, my old college roommate, David, who is now a senior corporate litigator in downtown Chicago. David, I said, my voice shaking as I stared at the multi-million-dollar Ferrari. I need the absolute best asset protection lawyer you know. And I need armed security at an address in Oak Haven, Ohio, in the next 45 minutes. Money is no longer an object. The next hour was a blur of frantic coordination. David didn't ask questions. He heard the absolute panic in my voice and went to work. He routed me to a man named Jonathan Pierce, a bulldog of an estate lawyer who specialized in high-net-worth individuals. I sent him photos of Harrison's letter, the will, and the trust documents. Arthur, listen to me carefully, Pierce said over the phone, his voice sharp and authoritative. As of right now, you are the legal trustee. Those vehicles are personal property, completely shielded by the trust Harrison established in Nevada 12 years ago. They are not part of the probate estate. Beatrice has zero legal standing. Do not leave that shed. If they try to enter, it is breaking and entering. 20 minutes later, 2 black SUVs tore up the muddy driveway, stopping right in front of the thicket. 4 large men in tactical gear stepped out. They were from a private security firm David had retained. Mr. Pendleton? The lead guard asked, approaching the shed. We're here to secure the perimeter. Not a moment too soon. Less than 10 minutes later, Gallagher's polished SUV returned, flanked by a local Oak Haven sheriff's cruiser and Beatrice's silver Lexus. Beatrice practically leaped out of her car, her face twisted in a mask of pure greed and fury. Gallagher flanked her, looking smug, holding a thick stack of legal papers. The local sheriff, an older man named Miller, who looked terribly exhausted by the rain and the mud, trudged behind them. Arthur, Beatrice shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at me. You manipulative thief! Step away from that building! We know what's in there! You hid assets from the family! I stood in the doorway of the open shed, the massive, intimidating frames of my newly hired private security flanking me on both sides. Sheriff Miller, Gallagher said smoothly, stepping forward with his slick, practiced smile. My firm is representing Miss Beatrice here. We have an emergency injunction filed with the county to freeze all assets on this property. Mr. Pendleton is attempting to liquidate stolen family heirlooms. Sheriff Miller adjusted his belt and looked at me. Son, I'm going to need you to step aside and let us secure whatever is in that building until a judge can look at this. Sheriff, I said calmly, handing my phone to him. This is Jonathan Pierce. He's an attorney, with the firm of Crane and Sterling in Chicago. I highly recommend you speak with him before you violate a federal trust. Miller looked skeptical but took the phone. For 3 minutes, the only sound was the wind howling through the dead trees and the muffled, sharp tone of my lawyer educating the local sheriff on federal property law. I watched the color slowly drain from Miller's face. He handed the phone back to me and turned to Gallagher. "Mr. Gallagher," Miller grunted, his voice suddenly hard, "this injunction you handed me is for an estate probate freeze. But according to the federal trust documents, Mr. Pierce just sent to my cruiser's laptop, the contents of that shed are property of a blind trust. They belong exclusively to Arthur Pendleton. Your injunction isn't worth the paper it's printed on." "What?" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking. "That's a lie! Harrison was a senile old fool! He owed my mother money!" "Ma'am," Sheriff Miller said, holding up a hand, "this is private property, and right now, you and Mr. Gallagher are trespassing. Mr. Pendleton has a legal right to ask you to leave, and considering he has armed security here, I suggest you do so peacefully." Gallagher's smug facade completely shattered. The cool, collected developer looked like a rabid dog that had just been backed into a corner. "You think you've won, Pendleton?" Gallagher snarled, his face flushed with rage. "You don't know how to handle cars like that. The maintenance alone will bankrupt you. You're a nobody in a cheap jacket." "I might be a nobody, Richard," I replied, looking him dead in the eye. "But I'm a nobody who owns a 1961 Ferrari California Spider. Now get off my land before I have you arrested." Defeated, humiliated, and outplayed, Gallagher turned and stormed back to his SUV. Beatrice stood there for a moment, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, before she finally realized it was over. She let out a frustrated scream, stomped back to her Lexus, and sped away, throwing mud all over Gallagher's windshield in the process. The aftermath was a whirlwind of surreal, life-altering events. Jonathan Pierce brought in an elite team from RM Sotheby's to extract the cars. Watching the multi-million-dollar machines being carefully loaded onto enclosed, climate-controlled transport trucks felt like watching a dream unfold in real time. The story of the Oak Haven Ghost Fleet broke a month later in the automotive world. The cars were shipped directly to Monterey Car Week for a highly publicized auction. Sarah, fully recovered from her injuries and looking more beautiful than ever, sat beside me in the VIP section as the bidding began. The Shelby Cobra hammered for $3.2 million. The Gullwing fetched $2.8 million. The Daytona pulled in a very respectable $1.5 million. But it was the Ferrari that stopped the room. Bidding started at $8 million and skyrocketed in a matter of seconds. Two European collectors engaged in a fierce bidding war. When the auctioneer's gavel finally slammed down, the room erupted in applause. The final hammer price for the Ferrari 250 GT SWB California Spider was $16.4 million. In a single afternoon, Uncle Harrison's worthless shed generated a staggering $23.9 million. Gallagher Development went bankrupt 6 months later. It turned out Richard had severely over-leveraged his firm to try and buy the land out from under me, and when the deal fell through, his investors turned on him. He was currently under investigation by the state for predatory real estate practices. Beatrice never spoke to me again, though I heard through the family grapevine that she tried to sue the estate lawyer, Thomas Abernathy, and had her case thrown out of court with prejudice. As for Sarah and me, we paid off every single medical bill. We didn't sell the Oak Haven land. Instead, we cleared the thorny brush, tore down the old trailer, and built a beautiful, custom farmhouse on the 40 acres. But we left the rusted iron shed exactly where it was. We reinforced the walls, fixed the roof, and turned it into a private garage. Above the heavy steel doors, I had a bronze plaque installed. It read, "Harrison's Haven." To the man who knew the value of patience. Sometimes, late at night, I walk out to that shed. It doesn't hold multi-million-dollar classic cars anymore. Just my daily driver and a few tools. But every time I flip that heavy breaker switch and hear the fluorescent lights hum to life, I smile. I remember the day I almost traded a kingdom for pennies, and I thank God I had the sense to break the lock. Uncle Harrison's secret didn't just change my bank account. It proved that the people who pressure you the most usually have the most to gain from your ignorance. If you enjoyed this journey from worthless dirt to a multi-million-dollar treasure, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder to never settle. You never know what's behind the next rusted door.